Hi everybody, my name is Dave West. It's a bit like Men with Blazers today. We've got Mick and myself both bald, so hopefully you'll be able to tell the difference from accents. As you can tell, I've got the ridiculous English accent, though strangely I'm in America talking to you, and then we have Mick, Kersten, CEO and founder of Tasktop here as well, who's talking to us from London. Mick?
Yes, hello.
So, and he has this sort of American Canadian sort of accent, so that's how you'll be able to differentiate us. So it's funny, the reason why we're talking about this topic was, so Mick and I have known each other for an awfully long time now. We worked together at Tasktop, and we were continually talking about the sort of clash between often how people were implementing tools and complex tool architectures, you know, whether it's your Jira and your Git and your ServiceNow or your Zendesk or your this or your HP Quality Center, the way that they were implementing these tools and the way in which they were meant to be doing work with Agile and Scrum practices. Scrum had become incredibly popular and continues to be incredibly popular, even though now I run Scrum.org, so I haven't managed to destroy it yet. And what we were talking about was very much this sort of clash of tools culture with the sort of organic kind of nature of work and how people are managing work. You know, ultimately, often they were managing them in war rooms with Post-it notes on the wall. And so this conversation has been going for a long time. And recently we, you know, Mick's in the process of writing a fabulous book. I don't know if it's fabulous, actually, honestly, yet. I haven't seen it, but I've seen some of the work that he's been doing. And so we've been talking a lot more about this. And I was lamenting or sort of depressed conversation about the fact that what we see in many organizations is the tool chains and the value stream of software delivery and product delivery was getting in the way and continues to get in the way of really teams self-organizing and the like. So self-organizing and deciding their own destiny. So this webinar today, this conversation today, and I think I would be true to say, Mick, I don't know, we haven't got all the answers about this, but we'll share some of our observations about how both of us are approaching organizations from very different places, but often both in the same organizations, and there's some level of sort of culture clash between that. So you can see our contact details there. Feel free to reach out to us after the webinar to say, hey, that was interesting, or that was absolutely rubbish. I'll obviously be deleting those emails instantly or those tweets. But feel free to carry this conversation on. I know we haven't really got any answers because, the other thing that sort of how to manage these value streams so they don't manage you. And one thing that was very clear over and over again from our conversation was that ultimately it is easy for teams to become victims because of the value stream that they work in. Historically, it was called waterfall. Now I think it's called this is the way we do it at bank X or insurance company Y. And so it's very easy for Agile teams to be basically managed out of agility if they're not careful. So what we're going to talk about is our experiences around these two sort of Scrum and value streams and how they broadly fit together. And that sets the scene. But before we do that, a little bit of an intro. Interestingly, so I left Tasktop to take over and to run Scrum.org for my friend Ken Schwaber. Scrum.org, interestingly though, even though we're the home of Scrum and we working with Scrum Inc., manage the Scrum Guide and the body of knowledge around Scrum. Interestingly though, our mission isn't around Scrum, it's about improving the profession. And really, the software delivery is increasingly getting grey there. It's sort of product delivery, it's people doing complex work. We're about trying to make your jobs more professional in a way. And we believe that at the heart of that professionalism is the acceptance that for complex work, empiricism and self-organization are necessary. So that's what we do. And, we do that by, a few things. We have a community of about 200 and actually that's over now, 223. This is always out of date. 223 professional Scrum trainers all around the world delivering, a little bit over 3,000 training classes, training 3,000 people a month-ish, and you can see the certification business and the whole professionalism element. And interestingly, the number of people that are doing Scrum today is well over 12 million. I think, that most organizations are at least sort of doing some form of Scrum. Now, whether it's good Scrum is a whole different question. But so that's who we are. And Scrum, we're the home of Scrum. And I just want to remind everybody what Scrum is, because I think a lot of people sort of forget it, Ultimately, Scrum doesn't have that much complexity in it. It has two things. And this is one of the rubs with value streams, one of the sort of challenges that we have, because Scrum is basically, people talk about this picture on the right, on my right, I guess it's your right as well. But ultimately, there's two things that Scrum is about. It's about empiricism, the idea of inspecting and adapting through transparency, that you break work down, you basically deliver something, inspect it, get that feedback back, that hypothesis, that evaluation, that visibility. And it's about self-organization and empowering teams. And what's really crazy is, I'm speaking to you from Burlington, Massachusetts, and in the office where the first ever Scrum project happened. And it was born out of necessity. Jeff was the CTO of an organization. He brought Ken in to help him run engineering and deliver some product. And they found it was very hard. They went off, did research, came back, brought Scrum. And interestingly, and we'll talk more about this later, one of the places where Jeff went was Harvard, where they were, an MIT, where they were basically researching what became lean thinking, that Toyota way, and a lot of the ideas around flow and the management of constraints, basically, the sort of Deming work. And then that led to this concept in Scrum of continuous improvement. So empiricism, self-organization, and continually improving. And I guess that's where the rub is, because ultimately, if you empower teams, you allow them to improve, you put empiricism in place, then sometimes some of the processes and situations that they work in require them to integrate with a value stream that is broader than that team. And so these are some of the questions we're going to be trying to address. So Mick, tell me a bit about this value stream thingamabob.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And I think some of the really interesting discussions that Dave and I have been having over the last while, they come from the sort of the different lenses that we see organizations adopting Agile, adopting Lean, adopting DevOps doing. And I think some of the key things I've learned from Dave over the last year or so are insights that come from this great body of work that Scrum has, in addition to all the experience doing the training and certification. A lot of our knowledge at Tasktop has come from learning how these tool chains work within these organizations. We've got insight into the ground truth of the stuff that's flowing through these tool chains, and we started calling those flows these value streams. In the end, if you're spending these tremendous amounts of money and of staff on software delivery at a large organization, you're investing in bringing business value to your market through software, and that's what we call these value streams. And Tasktop's come from the point of realizing that the biggest bottleneck to delivering that business value, to becoming a software innovator, are these bottlenecks, are these disconnects between the tool chains. Of course, there's an interplay, and I think that's why Dave and I are chatting even more these days, between what's flowing through those tools, which is in the end the result of creative work being done by each kind of person, by business analysts, developers, testers, people on the ops and support side, and their work product flows through these tools. So you could absolutely have a cultural bottleneck where nobody's thinking Agile, nobody's been trained on Agile, but even if you've addressed that bottleneck, you could still have a bottleneck within the tools where they can't communicate, they can't flow information, where release is not automated in the way that it goes to market and provides feedback again to the organization. So in the end, what we realized is we need a more disciplined and structured way of thinking about software value streams, both from a tool and infrastructure point of view, but also from an organization point of view. For example, Dave, reaching way back to the way that we were looking at it, we realized that functional silos and this decomposition that often leads to these siloed tool chains is both an issue at an organization level. It's kind of the opposite of what feature teams and these horizontal organizations are, and it's an issue at the tool level. So we need to address both, and I think that's exactly what both Scrum.org and what Tasktop are doing. So before we jump into understanding more about value streams, the way that we've been analyzing them, the way we've been looking at them, is to try to find these patterns in the way organizations actually connect their tool chains. So what we've done, and this is kind of a key part in the book, on what's been analyzed in the book is analyzing these 309 value streams within our customer base. See, these are predominantly Fortune 500 companies, and what we've been able to look at is how they're trying to connect the different flows all the way from kind of the business ideation design side through agile planning, release planning, and so on, development, and then to the CI/CD side, the continuous integration, continuous delivery side and right to release management. And we've noticed some interesting patterns in terms of what kinds of things flow. So here's just a few interesting statistics. So 70% of organizations have to connect more than 3 different endpoints because they've made these siloed tool decisions, not to mention that there's been this Cambrian explosion of Agile and DevOps tools where tools are best of breed, where we even see organizations with 3 different Agile tools because different value streams within the organization have actually selected a different Agile tool. Sometimes that makes sense. For example, if one of them's using Azure and .NET, you'll probably want to use Visual Studio Online and VSTS, whereas the people doing Java and Node.js, a more natural choice would be something like Jira. 40% of organizations connect 4 or more tools, and then even more interestingly, we've identified these different integration patterns so that 2/3 of organizations use 4 to 8 different integration patterns. And the integration patterns are even more interesting because they're kind of the layer above the tool chain. They're how people communicate, how information flows between people. And this is where, as we'll talk about shortly, if you give people a chance to self-organize and connect, they'll actually break through those tool silos. They'll find ways to do that. You give them a tool, and obviously Tasktop's focused on creating an infrastructure tool for that. To connect, you'll actually you'll connect these flows, and you'll have far fewer impediments. You'll have the DevOps principle of flow, and of course feedback as you're learning from what you've released and feeding back into the design and planning and strategy cycle. So Dave, if you go to the next slide. The key thing that we've been noticing is that organizations, this is back to that point on structure, organizations have these, they have not formalized their value streams. So they kind of understand their teams, and they might have structured into feature teams, for example. But those feature teams, and the features teams will naturally want to be aligned to value streams because they're naturally trying to deliver some product with hopefully some product owner, hopefully a structure in place like Scrum. But there are these dependencies between these teams. And at an organizational level, so if we look at the org chart, if we actually look at the tool selection, if we look at how communication, and go back a slide, Dave, how communication and collaboration work, there are all these dependencies between these different teams. And what we've noticed is that we're not formalizing value streams. And this is where Dave and I started chatting is, can we use, for example, Nexus to connect these Scrum of Scrums at a cultural level? But if we do that, how do we actually formalize this at an organization level? How do we implement this in the toolchain itself? And how do we make sure that when the bottleneck becomes dependencies between teams, we allow them to both self-organize, let's say someone support things like taking pull requests from one team to another, but support all of this through a toolchain, through an infrastructure that can support this dynamic system that becomes your value streams. And what I've noticed is a lot of the effort in these agile transformations happens at the team level, but we just do not have enough of a language, an infrastructure, or a methodology at reasoning at the value stream level.
So can I just interrupt for a second, because it's kind of ironic, and so when I joined Scrum.org about almost 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, we were just embarking on sort of releasing something called Nexus, and recently I wrote a book with Patricia and Kurt here. When I say I wrote a book, I helped get a book out with those two fabulous people. What was interesting, though, is instead of doing this sort of like, oh, let's sit in an ivory tower and build a methodology, build an approach, what Nexus came out of very much, okay, so Scrum's being used at scale. There's no ifs or buts about that. What are some of the common patterns, and do we need to fix Scrum, which then turned into Nexus, some of the better things? And one of those things that you highlighted, I think it's sort of ironic, is that, or certainly very interesting, is that integration was the biggest issue, and that there's huge dependencies across teams, particularly as most teams would sort of follow that kind of like feature teams, follow the value, build teams around value, customer value, deliver value to customers. And then you ended up with this sort of like disconnect because the architecture, the systems, the products they were, the software they were working in, wasn't as aligned in that way, So you ended up with these massive dependencies. And one of the reasons why the Nexus integration team, and we'll talk briefly about that at the end a little bit more a bit. The reason why we sort of created the Nexus integration team was in the same way as why we have a Scrum Master in the team. Obviously, a perfect team, you know, can self-organize and self-manage. You don't need somebody helping them be more agile, helping them to, you know, follow the process of Scrum and to, you know, make things more transparent. You don't need somebody taking impediments because a team can do all of those things. So the Scrum Master is an admission that unfortunately in most situations you don't have that. You know, in most situations your journey to utopia is long and complex, and the knit is exactly the same. It facilitates and to enables that level of integration. So it's funny though. I was thinking that, and I've thought this a few times, but I wanted to share that with the audience, that Nick, when you were talking so much, that's exactly how sort of Nexus and Nick came, was exactly the work that you're doing as well.
Yeah, and this is, so there's an interesting question that just came in, and by the way, we will try to answer your questions as we're able to as we go, in addition to at the end, but this Eric here said that this sounds to me like you're talking about the development stream, not the value stream. And so I think this is an interesting thing, because I think we've gotten quite good at the organizations who have adopted feature teams. You know, Tasktop uses feature teams at managing these development streams. And once you scale things up, what a lot of organizations notice is, for example, that the dependencies between those development streams, and just call them feature teams for now, and of course you could do development streams slightly differently, they become this very difficult thing to manage. And then Dave just hit on one of the reasons that happens, because a lot of the software architectures that we have are not architected to optimize for value stream flow. So for example, there might be a layered separation. You might have an older architecture of the model view controller, or your microservices might be more aligned to technology choices than they are to your actual value streams. If you start formalizing your value streams and architecting for the value stream, all you're really optimizing for is not that kind of separation of concerns, is how much you can flow through this value stream. And so let's say that you've got two value streams dependent on each other. One is an SDK or a platform component. Another one is something that delivers features in the form of a mobile user interface or a web UI. You'll actually architect to make sure that the value stream you depend on provides you with all the API that you need for that feature team who's doing the user interface to flow features as quickly as they can. So I think this is ongoing discussions that Dave and I are having, and we're having with some others, on what do you need to formalize around your value streams in order to make them more effective, in order to make flow effective, because they are bigger than just your development streams. And if you need to architect for them, or if you have an organizational structure for them, such as Nexus, what does that mean? And how does that need to be supported in your tool chain, in your organization, in your reporting structure, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it's even, sorry, I'll move on to the next slide. We could talk for hours just about this one slide, but I will move on. And
so this other key finding that we've noticed is, I think a lot of it's certainly a lot of my previous thinking on this until I actually went and visited a car manufacturing plant, was that we should think about value streams linearly. So methodologies such as theory of constraints or Donald Reinerson's product development flow seem to imply that we're basically these value streams go from left, which is usually value streams rely on the customer pulling things. And so you've got this question is, what kind of values the customer pulling? And we know the customer, at least in the book, Project to Product, I described the pull as this endless desire that our customers, the market has for things like features or defects or better performance, those kinds of things that customers can see. So we're going to pull that through value streams, and they tend to consume these value streams, customers, as products. Because that's what they know from an organization. They could be internal or external products. And what's interesting that we've noticed in looking at those 309 value stream architectures, then these are the real architectures. This is what organizations are trying to flow in delivering value to their customers, is that they're not these linear processes. They're much different than the simplified continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines that we see. There's actually, if you look at how a feature will flow through an organization, there's actually a network. And it looks a lot more like the way a plane might be routed between different hub cities than it looks like a linear manufacturing line and how a car is built. And this has all sorts of really interesting implications in terms of the fact that how you think about bottlenecks. If you've got a network that you're managing, which instantly Donald Reinerson suggests that production is in product development flow, you won't have a bottleneck that stops production. So you might have a tornado when part of your network, but then you reroute things around it. And this is where we get back to these really interesting points that Dave, you've been making about the autonomy for teams, right? Teams know how to self-organize or reorganize themselves, or if some of them all got the flu, that work can be done somewhere else. So again, I think the key thing that we're trying to do with these notion of value stream networks is notice it's not a linear production process. It's a creative process. All these interesting things that we've learned through Scrum come in, and how do we zoom out, and what can we zoom out, both from an infrastructure level and a team and organization level, in order to make these value stream networks visible and efficient. So.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because we see over and over again when Agile in the enterprise fails, we see it over and over again. It's because the managing this network. Do you allow the teams to manage the network and to organize in some way? I mean, do you get the people together and say, okay, this is what we're trying to do. These are the elements you've got. Let's spend a day working out how to make everything flow through this thing. Or do you and you use things like technology like open space and the like to facilitate that? Or do you get a bunch of very smart people, probably people with very little hair, like Nick and myself, to sit in a room and to work out this fabulous process, and maybe you employ some management consulting firm, and then push it down to the teams? And I think that Nick's point about it's not a manufacturing process, it's not an industrial process in the same way as building a car is really spot on, because we see that analogy or that metaphor breaking a lot of enterprise transformations because around Agile, because they want to use that model. I mean, ultimately, it's about managing resources, whether they're humans or other types. And it really isn't. And I think that's a really interesting point, Mick.
And just one other point to add to this, because Mark just asked the question, how can you measure success for this within your organization or team? And so when we think to that network metaphor, all that matters is how many passengers you got to some destination. So in this, all that matters is how much flows, how much business value flows through your value stream. You can measure what kinds of business value, how quickly it flows, what velocity teams deliver with. Again, look for bottlenecks where you can increase the flow. But really, if you take a value stream point of view, all that matters is how much is flowing through your value streams.
Unless you're the pilot. And then it matters exactly what's happening on the plane as you move through. And that's a really interesting point, Mick, because what we see over and over again is that people, they want to manage all of they think all the measures that are important are the things in between each individual node here. You know, how much velocity, how much defects, how many commits, how much code's being created, how many tests created, how much requirements. But ultimately it's not. It's about the destination that matters, to use your plane analogy. It's about how we get from point A if we get to point B, and how happy your customers are when we get there. It isn't about the bit in between, the routing in the middle. So we're going to talk later about evidence-based measurement. And I think that, Mark, your question's spot on, and I saw it and avoided talking about it until later, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the measures that we consider to be important. Again, this is sort of evolving, but we're starting to see that are important.
All right, and then I'll get back. There's a really interesting question on how this relates to scaled Agile framework, and we'll get back to that one as well. Okay, so just to keep going, we've gone to at Tasktop. We had this practice of helping customers identifying different layers of their value stream, and these value streams tend to be supported by tool chains. For example, you can imagine this kind of model-based layer that you're seeing here of how things flow through the different stages of artifacts that then live through different systems. And we'll get back to this in a second. But what we know is that we've got these methodologies. So we've got things like the scaled Agile framework and Nexus and disk plan of delivery. This is how teams deliver software. But again, I think the real difference is where, and of course, as Richard's questions ask, is how is this different between SAFe, which Richard says seems to be based on Ryan's book, and there definitely are a lot of similarities, and it builds on it quite a bit. But what we're trying to do here is formalize this notion of value streams beyond, and it is a definitely compatible notion of value streams as you see in SAFe and how you align to them, but really come up with a higher level way of measuring them and then implementing them. So providing the infrastructure to create them. So whether you're going to choose, whichever discipline you're going to choose to actually do your delivery with. So I think that's something we can get back to, Dave. Next slide.
So I just want to talk briefly about enterprise. So it's funny you should say safe and the like. You know, what we see in most organizations isn't really the approach that it's not the thing that they're doing, it's how they're doing it that's the problem. So when people want to be, everybody wants to be agile today, and fair play. I mean, who wouldn't be? I mean, the opposite to agile sounds particularly uncool, right? But so they all want to be agile, and they say, okay, we want to be agile, and they want to deliver more value to customers, be more efficient. They want their cake, they want to be able to eat it, and they don't want to pay for it. It's great. So that's what agile means. So I'm being a little facetious there, but they want to be agile. I get that. And they always start, every organization I've ever encountered starts with a pilot project. They pick a simple, small project, unless they're forced not to, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and lots of motivated people, and they get going, and guess what? They are successful. It works brilliantly, right? And then they say, well, this is brilliant. Let's scale it. Let's use people from the pilot to spread the ideas. Let's infect like a virus. That's cool. Some of those people are probably left and earning lots more money doing something else, or maybe even earning lots of money teaching agility now. So they're like, okay, well, the ones that are left, we'll spread those ideas. And obviously we need to, because we're scaling it, we need to approach this very differently, and we need to build a plan. We need to engage a consulting firm. We need to do a massive statement of work. We need to determine the budget, and then we need to execute on that plan. We train everyone at all levels first, get them trained, introduce coaches, have them do that. It'd be great. Measure it by actually the motion, because we don't because I mean, they're all working on different projects, so the value is ultimately different. And hang on a minute. Isn't that a little bit waterfall? What we see over and over again is in this area of complexity that is delivering agile to an enterprise, we see over and over again that most organizations approach this in a very waterfall model. And what's interesting about this, and I can't talk in detail about Scaled Agile Framework. I don't know it. I know some of the people that are involved in it. They're awesome people. But you know, I don't know it in enough detail. But ultimately, and I think, you know, Mick often calls these approaches methodologies, and what we've found is when you decide on a methodology, when you systematically approach this as though you can implement it in that way, you're not going to be very agile. It's a complex problem. So the first thing that you have to do, any complex problem, is break it down into continuously delivering value and inspection and adaptation. Ultimately, what agile is, it's only three things. It is empiricism. How can you basically inspect your work frequently, get feedback from that? Because I don't know what you want until I've given you something that you don't want. It's a bit like marriage, really, you know. I don't know what's wrong until I've done something. So, you know, I love it that my wife said, she says often when my mother-in-law visits that, you know, she goes, well, that went well. I said, that went well because I didn't say anything. I don't know if it went well. I just sat there the entire time. But ultimately, the only way is to get that sort of feedback life cycle, apart from with your mother-in-law, which you probably shouldn't, and just keep your head down. But the other thing that's really interesting, the other part of agility is self-organization and empowered teams. You've got to do, you know, facilitate and to enable that to happen. And the third part is improvement. Those teams are not only delivering value in terms of to their customer, but also delivering value to themselves in terms of improving that thing. So I like, you know, I think it was it was Eric that said, why do you call them value streams? One of the most, this is how I think of it, and, you know, Mick has a different perspective, I'm sure. The reason why I call them value streams is ultimately we're trying to deliver value to ourselves so we can deliver value to customers. We're trying to build, you know, sort of like the Richard Branson, the way to customer success and shareholder happiness is through is happy people, employees. And when you ever go on a Virgin plane, everybody's like smiling, and I'm sure they give them alcohol or champagne to get them in that mode. It's brilliant. I recommend it. But ultimately, the reason why I think of it as a value stream is because of that. It's about creating a value to ultimately to deliver value to customers. And what's interesting about this is that, you know, to be agile, you don't use waterfall to be agile. You start at the bottom and you work your way up. You continuously deliver. You make things transparent. You make them very visible. And that network needs to be like, from day one, you need to start seeing how it works and seeing those connections and then empowering teams to fix them and then learning from that and improving. So that's what we see. And it's funny, you know, and Mick, you can talk to this slide. I took this from Computer Weekly, so I apologize, but I thought it was fabulous because it really just sums up the complexity that's in this value stream to deliver something to a customer today. You know, I'm sure if you look at this, you know, any large enterprise has probably got 90% of this. And what's cool about this is it shows that there's a very fabulous environment that we're delivering. That's, you know, stuff's happening, right? There's tools to do everything that you can possibly imagine. But what's challenging is, imagine, you know, you as a team, you pick the things that make sense to you, but then somebody else picks something different. You have to work together. How do you work together? You pick something else. It starts getting very complicated. You know, by bringing these organizations together, operations and development together, you're not necessarily solving this value stream challenge, you know. Mick, I don't know what you think about this slide.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the approach that we've come at this from is saying we've got these large Agile and DevOps transformations happening. You know, everyone is trying to do those things. They're sort of been understood and mostly validated to be proven directions in terms of improving software delivery. And it's kind of, as you pointed out before, Dave, it's kind of unassailable to whether to go Agile or not. But the problem that we've noticed is that the infrastructure that's there is actually making it very difficult. So without, for example, in a manufacturing plant, you cannot imagine having a manufacturing line that's not integrated, where work flows from one workstation to another. Yet that's exactly what we've done to our organizations, where we've allowed, let's say, different value streams to have different tool chains, allowed the silos, such as, you know, the service desk and operation side, to have a completely disconnected tool chain. As, you know, ServiceNow that's got some kind of manual import or export going in terms of how it talks to the Agile backlogs. And so by not taking this value stream thinking, and I think as Dave said it really is just about flowing value to the customer. It needs to be customer-centric, as Agile is. We've not thought the right way about the infrastructure that it takes to have an integrated value stream. And interestingly, the large organizations out there have, right? The FANGs have all built out. Their stack doesn't look like this, the Facebooks, Amazon, Netflix, Googles. They've actually created these completely connected value stream networks by investing in their own tool support. Yet the rest of the industry is kind of left putting these tools together, making independent choices, and not giving their teams working on those value streams a chance to succeed. So, Dave, I'm going to just reflect on something that you said that I think is just fascinating, which is that if you take this value stream focus, that you will actually, things like how happy and productive that people are within a value stream become critical. So I'll just tell you one thing we started doing at Tasktop now is we're starting to measure, and we've been measuring employee net promoter score for ages to see how happy our staff are, because we know that's a key leading indicator of our organizational productivity. But then we realized, as we started thinking more and more formalized around the value streams, that we actually need to measure employee NPS per value stream, because we might have one value stream that's got much happier staff on it than another, because we've done a lot more automation, we've taken a lot of their busy work out and so on. Yet the people working on a more legacy part of our portfolio might have a value stream infrastructure that's just getting in their way of getting work done. Or we might not have given this one team the chance to properly self-organize because of some, let's say, some organizational data or cultural data or something of that sort. So we've actually taken this thing seriously enough that we now measure our staff's happiness per value stream, which interestingly it would be very difficult to do per team. So again, having this high level construct really helps, because eNPS would break down if you did it per team, because you could identify people, and which is the opposite of what you want with NPS. You want that safety for the staff to report their NPS scores in a very genuine way. So again, I think there's something wrong with this picture, and it's something wrong we're seeing these two things where Dave and I, I've absolutely been coming in from the infrastructure and tooling point of view, where this mess does not allow you to do DevOps, right? If this is what you're looking at, some slice of this in your organization, you're getting in the way of your transformation just by the number of things you have to connect and the sort of explosion of integrations that you have to deal with. You're missing that value stream integration infrastructure. And again, without that, are you really giving your teams the chance for autonomy? And you could be missing that if you've got a very siloed waterfall organization where you're bringing people to the work every budget cycle and you're assigning people to different IT projects, then of course you've got no chance of, at the cultural level and organization level, really becoming agile. So I think that interesting thing is we're looking at from both ends.
And, oh, hang on. So we're trying to sort of get this balance, right? We're trying to ultimately, oops, sorry, I didn't touch my, we're trying to balance this sort of like pull between, and I think Eric, he asked a really interesting question. He said, so, after my glasses, it's very hard for me to read the questions. I have to move, getting old, What's about the limiting scope creep when all teams are self-empowered? Is there any way to continuously drive home the idea of a minimal viable product? But ultimately, we want some consistency across teams. That's what organizations give you. The likes of Google, the likes of Facebook, Amazon have got some level of consistency, but it is very much the minimal consistency necessary to allow teams to effectively work together. They've broken that tool chain into some very simple, there's a very simple, minimal sort of like process, which might not optimize at the whole, but it might optimize, optimize at the whole, but not necessarily the individual. So you'll see that teams will have separate tools that optimize for them and the like, but this balance is really what we're sort of focusing on. I don't know if you want to talk briefly about the tool layer, but that's where we see it mostly, right?
Yeah, and actually, I'm just going to add to your answer to Eric there about limiting scope creep in these situations when you've got a team that's empowered, that's trained, that's, let's say they might even have the right tool chain, everything that they need. So one thing Dave and I have been talking about very recently is how do you manage work in progress, WIP limits at the value stream level? Because in the end, people on the business side, unless you're a technology organization, if you're an enterprise organization, enterprise IT organization, people on the business side tend to completely glaze over when you start talking to them about user stories and story points. And it sounds rather, fairy tale like when when you start saying those things to someone who controls these budgets. Yet it is the business side that's actually pushing to get faster time to market, to get more features relevant to your user base through these value streams, right? To get the IT organization to deliver more, because of course everyone's differentiating on software, which means you're competing on your ability to deliver more faster and better and so on and safer. So this is, again, by elevating this concept to what's flowing through the value streams, what we're hoping actually is that we can give the business a language to help limit scope creep, help manage work in process across your value streams. Because we know if we give 10 business initiatives to one value stream and 100 to another, the one with 100 is going to get a whole lot less done than the one that's doing 5 or 10 in parallel. So again, I think we need to elevate out of just the user story and feature level up into this value stream level, and this can help. So
I think what I obviously I don't live and breathe value streams every day, though I come into contact with it. I think what I'm thinking is we make it transparent, and that means making it transparent to the business as well, right, Mick? I mean, that's ultimately what we need to do. If we make it transparent, we make it so it's very simple, and that means you have to make it simple. That means you have to, and then that gives, we all know from an Agile point of view that the only way to fix this, the only way to improve it is to make it transparent. And if you're doing lean, Kaizen, but improvements, you get a group of people together and you fix it, you make it better. What we're actually saying though probably is make it transparent, keep it as simple as possible, and then incrementally improve it en masse. Now maybe if you're using Nexus, that would be a knit, maybe there's some other mechanism that you use to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of getting these mechanisms, because one thing is how you measure it, how you measure flow in this thing and so on, which we'll touch on in a minute. But I just want to share one of the core things that we've discovered about these value stream networks is that they have, again, by examining them, by working with customers where we've integrated their value stream networks using Tasktop, is that they have different layers. And I think this is something quite interesting. It's a kind of a key part that gets described in my book. So the tool layer is an obvious one, right? We know what the tools are, and there'll tend to be a lot of tools. You identify the flows between the tools, and this is really the way there's these common artifacts, such as a user story, the way it flows across different tools, where that user story might originate as a ticket in ServiceNow. Then what's interesting is once you've connected your tool layer, and you can go to the next slide now, Dave, you actually see this artifact layer. And this artifact layer, there's something super fascinating about it because this thing is a graph. So it's a sophisticated network. It's clustered, tends to be clustered along the way creative work happens, because in the end, you're really only adding value in a software delivery when creative work is happening. Everything else should be automated or hopefully already is. So when we actually start inspecting these graphs, and we've been able to do that, what we see is this very interesting artifact layer. And imagine this, whichever methodology you're using. So we're doing Scrum at Tasktop, which means that we see the Scrum teams, we see that we see their we basically see that the way that they create user stories, the way those user stories like the test, the way they're released into releases. But the amazing thing about this artifact layer is that we can actually start measuring flows through the value stream. And you actually see these clustered along value streams. So for example, at Tasktop Hub is one of its value streams. Our previous product, Tasktop Sync, is another value stream, but they both depend on the integration in this value stream. And if you start visualizing these things in the tool, you'll see that they cluster, and you'll see, of course, that we have inefficiencies whenever we try to add a new feature that cuts across all three value streams on top of our platforms and SDKs. So the fascinating thing is that once you've got a value stream integration infrastructure, you can actually start looking at and inspecting your value streams. And then, Dave, go to the next slide. So you've got the tool layer, you've got this artifact layer, and then what we've started formalizing is this model layer. So this is really how things flow within each value stream. And here you see some of the common types that you might use in an Agile process. But one fascinating thing by formalizing this is that we learned, I think it was in February, is that writing enablement materials around a feature was not part of our value stream model, because why would it be? It turned out that was one of our main bottlenecks in terms of delivering features, because we don't consider a feature done until both the user documentation, but also the enablement materials are written. So we had a bottleneck that was actually outside of our value stream model, but we were able to see it because we saw that the artifacts that should have been completed, the features that should have been delivered in this particular release, weren't. So, and of course, they were delivered from a code point of view and testing point of view, but they were not delivered in terms of an end user value point of view, which is really the way your value streams are structured. So the team promptly added this part of the process of creating the enablement materials to our value stream model. And so this very interesting thing happens when you start, and of course the team did this on their own, because people were asking why on earth didn't those three features ship? They should have shipped. So this kind of gets back to your point, Dave, on the giving the teams the autonomy, the self-organization. The team for that value stream, this could be teams that, in our case, it is a team of teams, right? This is not a single Scrum team, it's multiple Scrum teams that works on this value stream. It's that team who knows and who has the best perspective on how to maximize flow and the amount of business value delivered. It's not a top-down thing, although at a business level, we really care. It's really important that there's a communication between the team working on that value stream and the business. To say, for example, if we're going to invest a lot of the flow for this release into risk stories, let's say around GDPR, because that's a very key thing in the industry right now. So that's going to take away from our feature delivery or from our technical debt takedown in this way, so that there's visibility to the business of the value stream while the value stream team, so let's say this Nexus, is able to optimize their own processes around maximizing those delivery goals. So how much business value they deliver with whichever kind of value they're focused on. And so this is how we've started approaching it. And this is kind of what we want to make easier and easier for others in the industry as well, is to give you this infrastructure layer and allow you to inspect that tool layer, just connect all those tools, so that you can start actually seeing flows, not just from user story open to user, start work to code commit to code deploy, right? Or user story started work to deployment, but really end to end. Because the example I just gave you around enablement materials would have never been noticed directly through Jira. So, and then of course, allowing you to model these value streams, so you give that team a chance to decide, okay, well, our bottleneck is that we don't have enough UX design because we've only hired developers. And guess what? You wanted really fancy screens and a really modern experience. So maybe we need to make that a core part of the investment in this value stream. Whereas the people on the mainframe or System Z, they might not need as many UX designers. So again, once you start thinking value streams, you're able to specialize the tool chains, specialize the kind of talent that you need, specialize the kind of investment that you need depending where in your horizons those value streams fall.
It's interesting, and I think ultimately it's becoming more transparent. And if you become more transparent, then you can improve it. That's the bottom line, in my opinion. I think this is a really interesting approach to thinking about this broader kind of like flow across the whole life cycle. So so there is obviously a disconnect, and I'm not going to belabor the point, because I think we've talked about it already, and a number of those excellent questions sort of highlighted that what is the balance between that. So the first question that sort of always comes up when we're talking about it, this value streams glue together stuff. What happens if that stuff changes? So how do we effectively manage change, Mick? Because so my natural answer to this is you need to keep your value streams as simple. When they cross multiple teams boundaries, you need to keep them as simple as possible. And that when we make them more and more elaborate to gather more and more data, and when we make them more and more elaborate to do more and more automation or some other, it becomes harder and harder and harder for them to change. What's your take?
Yeah, and so I think this is one of the areas I think exactly where we need to keep the dialogue going as an industry, because I think we're learning this right now. I don't have a quick answer, right? I do agree, Dave, I think with your view on this is if the organization mandates value streams top down and this is how they should work and these are all the stages and this is what you should implement, we will be absolutely back to waterfall structures. Whereas if we actually create this and nurture this network, where their feedback cycle, self-organization, where people are able to, for example, like, say, move between teams and do those kinds of things, we're basically supporting value streams as they should be, because in the end, these value streams, they're a dynamic system. And they're a complex, I believe this, and I actually think it could probably be proven, that these value stream networks are a complex enough system that you can't design them up front, that you have to let them emerge. And in the end, it's the people on your Scrum teams that have the biggest insight, and the people on your infrastructure teams, and the people on your design teams, and so on. I think we have taken Agile has always taken a step in this right direction with this notion of cross-functional teams, customer representation, and so on. Feature teams just basically build on that. But I think if we take that same concept up to the notion of a value stream, where you're allowing all the stakeholders on this value stream to form as a unit, and it's in the end, this is where I think Nexus gets interesting, because in the end, this is a team of teams that you now need to self-organize. And until they have the conversation, the 3 Scrum teams might not know that they're all bottlenecked on the fact that you've only got 1 UX designer, but you should have 5 between them. So I think even though I sometimes do want to pull out the Craggle myself, and in some of the Legos that we've built that my children take apart too quickly, I think this absolutely has to come bottom up, but with an organizational commitment to moving towards this product-oriented, customer-oriented, business-centric value streams that are autonomous enough to evolve themselves based on the business outcomes that are specified, right? Getting more usage of this application, getting more monthly active users, getting more revenue, getting more adoption on this internal billing component that's meant to be serving multiple lines of business, and so on.
So I'm going to take it one step further. I believe that organizations over 120, 150 people, I honestly believe that you can't, they're not functional. And I know that many of you work in organizations that are much bigger than that. But ultimately, I think that the constraints, particularly for highly complex, highly creative work, I think the constraints that you have to impose to get everybody to work together, it's like, if you want to do inspiration, creative jazz, you do not have a band of 300 people. You have a band of 10, 12, 6. Those people have to know each other really well. They need to, you can't suddenly, or if you want 300 people to play instruments together, then you have to follow a very defined routine. And that means that you only have a very limited amount of agility. So frankly, if and it might be the way that you accept that, but in the same way as that SpaceX has a relatively small organization to put an amazing series of rockets into space and land them. And they've made decisions around complexity and around innovation to enable that. You have to do the same thing, in my opinion. So I think that stuff needs to change, and that change needs to be visible. But that means that you can only empower an organization of a certain size to make and facilitate that level of change, from what I've seen, honestly.
And Dave and I had this for a while, because obviously Tasktop's customers are in the thousands and tens of thousands of IT staff. And I think where we're trending, because I don't think we're done with this discussion, is that just the same way as you have natural, once you get past the Scrum team size of 5 plus minus 2, sometimes the feature teams, I've seen, you sometimes see effective teams with 10, maybe 11 or 12 people on them. But once you get the team of teams going of that could well be the biggest number of people you can assign to a value stream. So basically that 10 times 10, 100 people. Yeah. And if you actually are thinking value streams, and of course more work and research needs to be done to understand this, but this is kind of where Dave and I appear to be meeting in the middle, is that you can't have an effective value stream with 500 people on it. You won't give them a chance to self-organize, because there's literature out there that says people, teams of teams have a maximum size because there's a similar dynamic in the leaders of those teams, who then form a team, of course. So it could well be, Dave, that 100 or 120 is the maximum effective size for a value stream as well. So.
Well, and obviously there's ways, high cohesion, low coupling, you can decouple them and then get them to work in very simple ways together, but ultimately that's what we see. I think we've sort of addressed this question. I am conscious of time. Who decides what the value stream is? Obviously this is there's a king. He sits upstairs and he says, or she, if it's a queen, says, okay, this is how it is. And I think you've heard from both Mick and I over and over again. I think we've actually agreed that it needs to be bottom up. Now, interestingly, obviously, the people that manage the overall organization, the people that need that transparency, they're a stakeholder in this, and they have a set of requirements, but ultimately, or a set of outcomes that they need. Ultimately, it's the teams that have to decide how the value stream is structured. Would you agree, Mick?
Mostly. I think...
Unless you're the king, like Mick. And then...
Well, no, I think the business, in the sense that the chief digital officer, the CIO, whoever this is in the organization, they can create a North Star. They can say, this is where time to market is going to make or break us. To the point where we need revenue in these value streams to go up, or we have no future because Amazon's going to take it, as you might in retail.
Totally agree. So they do it as a product owner for a value stream. I agree.
That's right. Exactly. So I think if we think value stream centric, the business can set these North Stars, these high level business outcomes, but then delivering on those outcomes has to be something that's done by the teams, by basically the teams within the value stream. And I think one of the things that's critical here, which is really similar to what you're saying, Dave, is if we're actually measuring these value streams on how much they deliver, how many features they deliver, if the teams are not setting those targets, we're going to get back into, as Sam Guggenheimer from Microsoft pointed out to me, the world of bug math, right, where the teams will actually make it look like they don't have these right, things look right in the flow in this value stream, right? That's our whole problem with PPM, pointing PPM and Agile. It just doesn't work. It's this weird mapping. If we don't give the teams autonomy over their flows, and correlate those flows to how many business results they've driven in terms of revenue generation, monthly active users, customer success and satisfaction, we're doing the wrong thing. So it's absolutely bottom up with direction set top down.
So I do agree. Sorry, and I didn't make that sort of clear. So this is a sort of question, and I think a couple of people have asked kind of similar sort of questions. How should you orient your value streams? And I think you said very much customer product sort of orientation rather than test like functional silo, move away from that functional silo. Would that be fair?
Completely. I think the software architecture should be oriented to the value stream as well. I think we're architecting our systems the wrong way. Microservices, 2 pizza teams, and so on, they're actually an indication of the right direction. But yeah, things look very different from an organizational and a software architecture point of view if you think this way.
So completely agree. I think feature teams and I think ultimately your value streams shouldn't be oriented around, this is the testing value stream, this is the development value stream, this is the ops and support value stream. They should be oriented around outcomes to customers. This is the, new customer acquisition value stream or whatever.
That's right.
We sort of mentioned it earlier, but this is sort of comes in from stage left. Strangely, Agile, so Scrum was created in response to the situation and blah, blah, blah. But it was inspired by, the word Scrum was inspired by the new product game by these two gentlemen that were working with James Womack, Daniel Jones and Daniel Roux on the machine that changed the world, on the same sort of research all about lean manufacturing. And what's really bizarre is that value streams and Scrum all came out of this work that was being done in Cambridge. I was going to say Boston, Mass, but technically in Cambridge. But that's just like that's like the front lawn of Boston, in my opinion. But don't quote me on that. But ultimately, I think that's really, really interesting that these things aren't dissimilar and they're actually motivated from the same point. We talked briefly about the importance of thinking sort of slightly differently, and Nexus isn't the same as SAFe or less or DAD. It's very much hey, these are some patterns for how teams work together, multiple Scrum teams work together. These are the things you need to concentrate on. These are some things you should probably not do from Scrum, particularly around the actual sprint review, and you should actually do that at the cross-team level. And really, it's just Scrum, but ultimately, it's about delivering an integrated increment continuously across multiple teams. And you'll notice that the Nexus integration team is a key part of that, which seems like a great place to start getting a group of people to worry about the value streams. So I know our time. I was completely shocked we managed to get past the first slide, but we have a lot to talk about in this area. So just to close, the broader the value stream, the simpler it should be. If you don't have the benefit of being an organization that's less than 150 people, then you're going to have to keep your value streams incredibly simple. Otherwise, you're going to reduce the flexibility and the agility of the team. Ensure that those value streams are engineered appropriately, and that's cohesion, meaning they do one thing really well, and they're, a low amount of coupling. I should have written there, high cohesion, low coupling. People product centric is the best. Use an agile approach to build and maintain them. That means a product owner, but it doesn't mean the product owner tells them what to do. It's what they're trying in terms of the outcomes, not in terms of the actual work. Focus on value, not efficiency, but ideally do both, because ultimately by doing things better, you can deliver more value. By doing more value, you can do things better. Human beings are much better at this in some areas than in others. So sometimes we over-engineer our solutions. Remember that if you keep the process very simple, that value stream very simple, because you're in a large organization, then allow human beings to make decisions around that, to fill in the blanks. We didn't talk about this, but I think it was Richard probably that asked this, but how do you measure? EBM, mate. That's the bottom line. Outcome-based. Your measures need to be outcome-based. So think about that. These are just some outcomes that we find very important. Your delivery, unrealized value, speed, and your ability to innovate. Those four measures are really, really interesting. If you have those for each value stream, and then I think you're in a really, really good position. And then two fabulous books. One that's in print, one that's about to come out in print, but you can go to projectandproduct.org to either secure your early release copy of it, or at least to start the discussion. And then Nexus, which is really talking about how you can deal with some of these integration challenges and get your scrums, your teams of teams working together. I know we've overstayed our welcome, Mick, so that's why I whizzed through those slides. Anything to finally add?
No, I think I think some great questions on this webinar. And again, as you can tell, Dave and I are still exploring this. I'm documenting as much as I can of what we understand needs to happen in terms of supporting these project-to-product transformations, these doing Agile at scale, deploying Scrum at scale, and so on in this project-to-product book. So just really look forward to continuing the discussion, as I think we're really moving towards understanding value streams as a methodology, as a discipline, as a new kind of infrastructure to innovate at scale. So
cool. Well, thanks for your attention, everybody. I'll hand that back over to our host, Sarah. For the questions that we haven't answered, I'm sure somebody will come back to you and maybe we'll try to address them maybe in a future webinar. Thanks for your time.
That's right. Thank you, everyone. And
thanks,
this concludes the webinar. Bye.